Hello, this is Ed welcoming you to week 6. We've got 2 chapters we'll be covering this week. Chapter 14 that focuses on conflict and negotiation. Chapter 16 that focuses on organizational culture. So let's first talk about chapter 14. Anywhere you have more than one individual working, you're going to have conflict. It's just inevitable that sooner or later there'll be some disagreement, some difference of opinion. And it could range from a healthy discussion, because there is, very good, healthy conflict. Conflict can lead to a far better outcome. So conflict is not something that should be avoided. What's critical, though, is the conflict that does occur be functional, not dysfunctional. And we'll talk about those concepts this week in chapter 14. We're also going to talk about the negotiation process very briefly. But 2 key terms that you should keep in mind when you're approaching a bargaining session or a negotiation session is really deciding, do you want to have a distributive or integrative approach to the session? And it's really quite simple when you think about it. A distributive negotiation process, think of distributing, say, pieces of a pie. There's only so many pieces that can be distributed. And if your intent is to get as many pieces as you can for yourself, then that means the other individual at the table will get less. So think of it as a win-lose. You're distributing a limited amount of money or material. You're trying to get as much as you can for yourself, which means the other person gets less. So again, that's the classic win-lose approach to negotiation. The other approach is what's called integrative, where again you're integrating each other's interests into the discussion and trying to find not a compromise. A compromise implies someone loses, but you're really seeking to find an outcome that benefits you and would benefit me to the greatest extent possible, taking into account the interests of all parties. So you're integrating each other's interests into the process, really focusing on what can we do to get a win-win outcome where you are satisfied with the outcome and so am I. It depends on the organization and the culture. I've been involved in negotiations of both types. One key thing to keep in mind is in some negotiation processes you can elect to say no deal, leave status quo as is. But in other situations, you have to come to an outcome. And if one party or the other is stubborn, then it may very well default to a distributive process where there's a win-lose, because one party can't find a way to get to a win-win. So we'll talk about those concepts quite a bit in chapter 14. When we move on to chapter 16, looking at organizational culture, without a doubt, every organization has one. They're all quite different. Anytime you walk through an organization, some suggestions. Look at what's displayed on the boards. Look at their metrics on what they're measuring. What are they portraying to employees and visitors? Because those material components, often referred to as artifacts, really give you insight into what's driving the values of that organization. The metrics tell you very clearly, what's being assessed. How those metrics are created also gives you a very clear indicator into what the organization values. And what's interesting is when you look at those artifacts and then in contrast talk to employees that work there, you'll quickly determine the difference between espoused values and enacted values. Espoused, E-S-P-O-U-S-E-D, are the values that organizational leaders say this is what we believe in. It's typically seen in a company vision. It may be in the company mission statement. It may be, and definitely should be seen in the artifacts, the charts and slides you see, across an organization's walls. The enacted values, it's E-N-A-C-T-E-D, the enacted values are what organizational leaders actually do, what they actually value. And it's very common to see a disparity between the two. In some organizations that are transparent and fairly open, the gap is very small. In other organizations where leaders want to believe that they're very altruistically focused on and idealistically focused on all these high level values, only to find out that what they actually do, their actions, don't back up their words. So in that type of example, you're going to have enacted values that are drastically different than the values that are stated on company artifacts. And that makes a world of difference for the culture that employees there work in. So again, we'll talk about the concepts of organizational culture, how you go about assessing your own culture in an organization or that of another, and how metrics can drive that culture as well. You know, there's an old saying, the measure you set determines the behavior you get. And I'll say it again. The measure you set determines the behavior you get. So the metrics that are created by an organizational leader, before they're created, the first thought you should have is, what's the behavior I want to incentivize? Define the behaviors first, and then determine what metric would best result in a positive outcome in those specific behavioral areas. Now back to the logistics of the course. Again, just like in the previous weeks, we have two discussion questions. The first discussion question focuses on functional versus dysfunctional conflict. So you'll have a healthy discussion in that area. And then the second DQ focuses on your recommendations on how to create a positive work culture in Brazil. Again, being able to tie this into your term paper. The paper for this week keys off of that second discussion question. You're going to be writing a paper where you're going to summarize all the responses from your fellow students on discussion question 2 about how can a positive work environment be created in Brazil. So you're going to get the benefit of multiple levels of input. It's really giving you an opportunity to leverage the thoughts of your fellow classmates, and that should give you a very well-grounded approach that you can then incorporate into your term paper about how to create that positive work environment, positive organizational culture in Brazil if your organization were to set one up. So again, we also have a few videos this week. I included one on communication. It's only about a minute long. It's called the USS Montana. I think you'll find it quite amusing. What's also even more amusing is the video is based quite loosely on a real situation that occurred a number of years ago. It didn't occur exactly as you see in the video, but you know, Hollywood does take its creative license to make it more interesting. So again, I hope you enjoy this week. Oh, by the way, don't forget, your rough draft for your term paper is due this week as well. And I'll be turning those around quickly so you have adequate time to incorporate my feedback into your final paper before you submit it. So again, I look forward to this week. I hope you are as well, and I'll see you back in the classroom.